All right, next, let's look at some alternative principles, right? Because essentially what Senator Armstrong has done is said that the harm principle just is not applicable in this scenario because harm is not being done by the individual, neither at the, all right, because we are not necessary or sufficient conditions. I know, it's really fun to say. You guys should practice at home. Sufficient conditions. So next, let's see if we can run through a list of other type of arguments, principles, that we can try to track whether or not harm is being done using these other theories. So, can we ground the wrongness of individual emissions in some other way? So, let's start with the simple division approach. What the simple division approach says is that an action is morally wrong if it contributes to a collective harm. In this case, the agent is responsible for his or her share of the total amount of harm. So if you are polluting and they are polluting, each of us is responsible for a percentage of the total amount of harm that's being caused. Now, if we think about this, this is very similar to, remember, Norcross's argument when he talks about the causal impotence with respect to factory farming. Senator Armstrong does not address it in this reading, but does address that critique in a follow-up article that he writes in 2018. Now, clearly, the collection of human greenhouse gas emissions is causing harm. And clearly, each of our individual emissions contributes to the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In that case, a simple calculation will tell us our share of the total. And in fact, this has already been done. John Nolt did the math. He wrote in 2011, and I quote, "The average American causes through his or her lifetime greenhouse gas emissions the serious suffering and or deaths of 2 future people." So each of us in our lifetimes are causing the significant suffering or death of 2 future people. Now, this approach is maybe a bit confusing. Right? By contributing a share to the total greenhouse gas emissions, it does not follow that I therefore cause some percentage of the total harm. To claim so would be to make the mistake of thinking that a part of a cause of some harm is therefore a cause of a part of that harm. But this is false. In short, we can calculate our share of the total harm, but it is a mistake to infer from this that we therefore caused the share of the total harm. Right? So, for example, imagine an elephant. A collection of neurons caused this image in your mind, and each of those neurons is a part of that cause. But it would be a mistake to infer from this that therefore each neuron caused a part of the image in your mind. No, it's only the collective sense of all of those neurons, right? So this is a critique of using the simple division approach in this principle or in this scenario. What about the risk principle? Could we apply the risk principle here to this situation? And would this provide us a way of better understanding harm done by from the individual responsibility? So the risk principle says that an action is morally wrong if it causes an increase in the risk of harm to others. Now go back, remember I talked about swinging my hands? Swinging my arms above my head is not in itself morally wrong. But if I were doing it in a crowded space, it is increasing the risk of harming another person. And therefore, because that risk of harm is being increased, that action is morally wrong. So even if our individual emissions cause no harm, surely they increase the probability that harm will occur. And an action can still be morally wrong even if it does not actually harm anyone, and even if one's intentions are not malicious, but does increase the risk of harm to others. So for instance, consider someone who drives home drunk, but doesn't actually hit someone. Right? This is still morally wrong because it is increasing the risk of someone being harmed. Now, a reply to this could be that the problem with this proposal is that first, it is not clear that I even increase the risk of harm to others with my behavior. Right? Consider, what is the probability that plucking a single hair from someone will make them go from not bald to bald? Plausibly, zero chance. Number two, another problem is that even if it did cause some type of increase of risk of harm, it is not clear that there is any particular individual who is endangered by my activity. Right? Point out the person that I'm harming. Or, excuse me, third, and worst of all, this would be far too restrictive. For everything that we do adds at least a little risk to someone else. So for instance, just driving a car at all, even when I'm sober, runs a small risk of hurting someone. So on this principle, this risk principle, almost everything we do would be morally wrong to some extent, because anything we do is even minutely increasing the risk of harm to another person. Let's look at the third principle. It's called the general action principle, which says that an action is morally wrong if it would be bad or harmful for everyone to perform an action of the same kind. So going back to joyriding with your SUV on a Sunday afternoon, would it be morally wrong if everyone was joyriding on a Sunday afternoon in a gas-guzzling SUV? Well, first, it would not be bad for everyone to go for one single Sunday joyride. Climate change is the result of emissions all year round, over decades, or even over centuries. Furthermore, is this principle even correct? Wouldn't it also be disastrous if everyone in the world refused to become a doctor, or if everyone in the world moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? But surely, it is not morally wrong to not become a doctor or move to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So, in short, by that type of logic, we can argue that the general action principle is false. Okay, let's try the group principle. Does this give us any traction in understanding the individual responsibility? The group principle says that an action is morally wrong if it contributes to the collective action of a group or of individuals who are all performing an action of a certain type, and that group's action causes harm. All right, so you might need to read that a second time, and maybe a situation will help you understand it. Still, clearly, the collective action of human beings emitting greenhouse gases is causing harm. So the group is surely to blame for the harm. Furthermore, when I emit greenhouse gases, I join this collection as one of its contributors. So even if my individual contribution makes no difference, plausibly I still incur some of this blame at the individual level. For instance, consider this case. It's related to the bottom left picture here. We'll call it the car push. So you and 4 of your friends are pushing a car off of a cliff with an innocent person inside of it. It only takes the strength of 3 people to push the car. The car goes off the cliff and the person inside dies. Now, if we apply the necessary and the sufficient condition to this scenario, let's see what happens. So in this case, you are neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for that person's death. You're not sufficient because you would not have been strong enough to push the car by yourself. And you're not necessary because it only takes 3 people to push the car, and your added strength was not required. So in fact, no single person who pushed that car is a necessary or a sufficient cause of death in this case. So, has no one done anything wrong? So we're just simply basing this off of the harm principle, or in this case, the group principle. This is, let's be honest, this is absurd. the four of you are responsible for the death of that person. But, again, using these definitions about how harm can be done, we are not. To this, Sinod Armstrong responds to this worry by pointing out that the intentions of the people pushing the car matter in this case. Right? You and your friends intend the death of this one person. So perhaps even in cases where someone is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for harm, one's intentions can still make an action wrong if they are malicious intentions. But when I go for a joyride in my SUV, I do not intend harm to anyone. Presumably, I do not drive maliciously, but just for the fun of it. It is clear, says Sinod Armstrong, that in cases where someone contributes to a group harm in a casually impotent way without malicious intent, he or she has done no wrong. So Sinod Armstrong says that the group principle doesn't work here. Now, let's imagine a different scenario. The crowded, noisy airport. So you are in a crowded airport where everyone is talking. It is so noisy that several people miss an important announcement on the intercom, and they miss their flight as a result. At some point amidst the noise, you say to your friend, "I wish everyone would be quiet." Is saying something to your friend morally wrong in this instance? All right, it doesn't seem so, but think about it. As a group, you all collectively and unintentionally brought about harm to several people who missed their important flight. When you spoke to your friend, you contributed to the collective loudness of the group, which was the cause of the harm. So therefore, by the group principle, you have done something morally wrong, right? Go back and read the definition. By just simply speaking in that case, by this definition of the group principle, you have done something morally wrong. All right. Now, next, let's talk about virtue ethics, which says an action is morally wrong if it expresses a vice or is contrary to some virtue of character. Virtue ethics is a system of ethics that is more concerned with the character of the individual rather than the nature or the consequences of their action. One lives rightly, says the virtue ethicist, so long as one's actions display a virtuous character. On this view, we might be able to explain why the SUV joyride is morally wrong, namely, because doing so is not virtuous. To this, Sinod Armstrong may rebut by saying in order for this to be convincing, one would need to prove some reasons for why the joyrider is not acting virtuously. And there seems to be no such reasons. After all, the joyrider is just out for a bit of innocent fun. So is Sinod Armstrong right? Perhaps one reason we could provide to back up that virtue ethicists' claim is that the joyride is wasteful. Right? It's not necessary to survive, and it's unnecessary using up of resources. Right? It is eco-gluttony, to use our phrase from last lecture. And acting wastefully is not very virtuous, and is therefore morally wrong according to virtue ethics. Okay, so there seems to be some merit to this argument when applied to this scenario. What about the indirect harm principle, which says that an action is morally wrong if it leads to other actions which collectively cause harm to others? The idea here is that when I go on my joyride, others will see me, and this might cause them to view the action as morally acceptable, and then they too might go on joyrides. Additionally, I personally might cultivate a habit of going on joyrides, so that my first joyride leads to a lifetime of joyrides. Collectively, my single action has set off a domino effect that leads to a collection of actions that are harmful collectively. So in response, we could say that, well, first, this would only condemn the actions of those who are extremely popular or have addictive personalities, right? Second, our emissions are so minuscule compared to the whole. it is not even clear that a lifetime of Sunday joyrides makes any difference. For example, 50 years worth of 1-gallon joyrides would be equivalent to adding a little over half a cup of water to our 1-meter deep flood 5 times the size of Central Park. So maybe it's not that much. Our final principle is called the ideal law principle, which says that an action is morally wrong if it breaks a law that the government ought to enforce, even if it's not currently doing so. Sinod Armstrong admits that the government should be enforcing laws that should be curbing climate change. After all, at the government level, some governments are sufficient causes of climate change. If the U.S. were the only country emitting, for instance, then some climate change would most likely still occur. So one might suggest perhaps we are obligated to act now as if those laws were already in place, even if it's not a priority of the current administration. In response, might say that this just seems false. For instance, perhaps there is a better tax system that should be in place rather than one that we currently have. But does this entail that we should right now be sending in the amount of taxes that the ideal tax code would require of us? No, surely not. So I'm going to stop here. I know that's been a lot, but my hope is by going through all these different principles that are trying to explain why actions are morally wrong, by looking at different scenarios and different ideals, that we can see just how complicated Sinod Armstrong's argument is as it relates to climate change and our individual responsibility.